Hello, it's my,
Okay.
yes, it's my very, 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 very great honor and absolutely something unbelievable privilege and pleasure to introduce my old friend and also mentor, Millard Mott. Millard Mott played a huge role in my life, and I so much appreciate his impact on my life, career, thinking. So very, very great to see you, Millard. How are you?
Oh, I'm wonderful. I'm wonderful. Thank you. It's
Great.
wonderful seeing you after so many years.
Right.
I follow you on
We,
Facebook with your adventures and your
thank
educational
you. Thank you.
exploits, and so
Yes.
that's been fun.
Uh, we know each other, I believe, from 1989. When Millard came to Uzbekistan, he led a huge delegation from Organization Development Network. It's a huge management and organization development association network. And I think there were about 30 people or something like that. He visited our university, and then we saw that we have a lot of common things in our training, workshop, and consultancy approach. And he invited me to America. Of course, it was very difficult to travel at that time, but nevertheless, it happened. And I took part in Organization Development Conference in San Diego. And I spent about 40 days in my first trip in America. And I lived in the Millard House. And then I traveled many times also, and Millard was so much kind and hosted me and helped me to go to America. And he also played a big role in my visiting fellowship at Western Washington University. And Millard also was a big part of Tashkent, Seattle, sister city development. He played a huge role in the development of relationship between Seattle and Tashkent, which was a very unique, in fact, relationship because I believe it was the almost the single such a sister city relationship during the Soviet Union. And of course, Millard is a very well-known organization development consultant, specialist. He worked with businesses, organizations, universities, and now he is heading international organization, which helps Pakistani girls to get education. And he has many other accomplishments as a very much internationalist. Millard started his international career as a Peace Corps volunteer, I believe in Pakistan.
True.
So,
Yeah.
Millard, I know that I could tell many more things about you, but I hope during our conversation we will discuss all these different aspects of your life. Anyway, it's so great to see you. I think we saw each other in last time in 1992 in Montreal. Oh, no, in Toronto. It was
That's right.
Organization Development Conference. So it's, I think, 32 years. So
Oh,
that's
wow.
that's
How time
that's great to
flies.
see you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Uh,
the thing, not spend too much time on it, but the thing that you triggered for me, and kind of when we first met in Tashkent, we were, in some cases, we were like the first Americans to arrive in some of these places at that time.
right.
And I remember being in some office in Tashkent, and this woman walked in and said, we discovered you're here, and we would like to have you come over and speak at our university.
Right.
And and so you do stuff. You don't know what you're getting into, but it was an environment that was very exciting and adventuresome. And so I actually then went, and it turned out it was a large assembly filled with students and faculty. And it was sort of like a question and answer thing. And I responded to some question or whatever. And I think I was being very polite. Someone probably said, "What do you think of Uzbekistan?" or "What do you think of Tashkent or the Soviet Union?" And I was being diplomatic and tactful and stuff. And all of a sudden, and this is during the the fall of the Soviet Union and Gorbachev,
Perestroika.
perestroika and glasnost. And
Right.
so in the middle of what I was, saying, all of a sudden, people in the audience started chanting glasnost, glasnost, glasnost. And that is, hey, just be truthful, be open, tell us what you really think. And it just, it just ran chills down my back that was such incredible moment of openness and human connection. And and it was, I think, in that assembly that you came up to me afterwards and introduced yourself. And you're very smart because when you connected with me, because you mentioned the name of an individual, Carl Rogers, who's very famous historically in our field of group dynamics, organization development. And you had been to a workshop in Moscow with him, which was really unusual. And I already had kind of a task by our national association back in the States to find a couple people that we would sponsor and invite back to the States. So I was kind of on the lookout for someone to invite back. And so I was struck by that, but then afterwards, I don't know if you remember, there was a woman who was our translator, who was traveled with our group. She was from Tashkent. She was Russian, Rita. And so afterwards, I turned to Rita. I said, "Rita, so, I respond positively to that guy, Alisher. What do you know about him? What do you think about him?" And she says, "He would be a very good choice. He comes from a respected family in this country." And so it's very interesting. I mean, just that moment of connecting, and how you make choices, how you respond. And
Thank you. That trip and also some other my trips afterwards played such a huge role in my life. Everything was changed. We lived in former Soviet Union. We didn't travel. It was a Iron Curtain. And just to live in people's homes, to travel, to see the America, it's something very difficult for young generation to imagine what could be difference. So for us, in my generation, that was something unbelievable. Everything has changed in my life, and that was something, one of the most profound experience I had in my life. Just opened my eyes, and such a huge impact on my thinking and perspectives. That happened, first of all, because of your vision, your leadership, and your invitation. Everything was
I mean, one of the things that we were trying to, as we were also a reflection of the sister city relationship. So there were, hundreds of people that were involved in this whole process, doctors and teachers and so on. So we were one part of it, but the whole intent was trying to bring some humanization to what was this incredible 50 years of Cold War conflict, hardening the idea that these guys are enemies, and to try to bring things to a personal level, to break the stereotypes. And so I think that's what was a huge impact for you to come back to that conference, the Organization Development Conference, where there were several hundred people there. They had never met anyone from the Soviet Union. And to begin to just talk and discover you've got a sense of humor, you've got spirit, you've got personality, you've got ideas, and it's just human. And I just say one last thing. Given the whole 50 years of this Cold War, the emotion of landing in Moscow was incredible. for us Americans coming over in 81.
Right.
Because again, this frozen idea of an enemy, and then it's just like these shells slipping off your back as you're arriving and you're beginning to meet people that were as enthusiastic about connecting with you as a person as we were, with them. So it was a very special time. Very special time.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Millard, I propose using this opportunity a little bit to reflect on our experience, go back maybe for 30, 40 years and go through all these years and see what happened during this time, and maybe later on also go a little bit to forward. So from this point of view, can you ask, what do you think, how has the world changed during this time? So recent decades and years. So you've been always internationalist. You've been following the world development. So what happened? So for the last 30, 40 years, any big changes you noticed?
That's I mentioned earlier before we started recording, these are very good questions and they're challenging to answer. But I did think about it, and there are two main things that came out to me that in some ways I'm not sure I would have anticipated looking at the future. I think one of the biggest changes has been the women's movement. And I'm thinking back how my wife and I experienced it personally in the 70s, where she was at that point going through her awareness. We had been married for maybe 5 years. She went off to these groups with other women to discuss roles of women, challenging each other. Then they come home and challenge us, the men. Why do you do this? Why do I do that? And looking at and examining roles, and creates some tension. And so I think it's interesting how often you experience something in your life that changes, and you don't realize you're simply a microcosm, that this is bigger than what you may be thinking. And that's what I see, is that the women's movement is clearly an international phenomenon, which is incredibly important and influential. I mean, that's one. The other one that I'm not sure how much I really anticipated, but I think at least in this country here, the growth and power and centralization of corporations, that there's been a growth of a corporateness where we're almost like a corporate country now. And it really is a threat to civil liberties. And that's part of the challenge going on in the politics and the culture, is that we're trying to figure out. People know there's some kind of crisis in our country, can't really figure out what it is. And I think there's a lot of undefined expression of frustration in our politics. People talking about one thing without really understanding what really may be happening. My son works in Europe, in the Netherlands, and what's interesting is how much more the European Union does to protect civil liberties. And even the way a website works, how the default in this country is the default is that they can take your personal information. In Europe, they can't. The default is that your privacy is protected, and you have to actually click something. So I think these two, I think the rise of the corporate, the strength of the corporation, women's, those are a couple things that I think I would not have anticipated.
Yeah, it's very interesting. United States is famous with its individualism. There are many the so-called cultural dimensions.
Yeah.
Individualistic, collectivistic, hierarchical, horizontal, vertical, high context, low context, different kinds of measurement of culture. United States considered as number one in the world with its individualism. So everybody for himself, it's a kind of very important, how to say, the idea.
Yeah.
But what you are saying, corporatization. So how these two trends could coexist? On the one hand, to be such an individualistic society, but on the other hand, as you said, corporatization. You are part of something bigger, corporation. So don't you think it's a very interesting combination, maybe even paradoxical?
Well, no, it is paradoxical, and it's also mythical. I mean, the idea of the individual autonomy and freedom is sort of it's a myth, and there's some truth in it. There is some truth in it, but there's also some not truth in it, and but it gets mixed in with what is you know, a hard thing to figure out, and I think it is underneath some of the frustration politically in this country, where people feeling they have lost their autonomy, they're not being represented politically. I mean, certain groups, certain geographies, rural, urban, you know, so it's something that is just in the mix that, you know, is part of our debate here in this country.
Interesting.
So
Perhaps every society needs to tends to get some balance between individualism and collectivism. And somehow, even I published a paper many years ago, individualistic cultures try to get some kinds of maybe behind scene of collectivism. And collectivistic countries try to get some kinds of balance being behind the scene individualistic countries. Like in former Soviet Union, they were very much at the on stage, very much collectivistic society, but behind the scene, so backstage, there were a lot of individualism, so everybody for himself. But this is another very interesting dimension. But I'd like to go back to international dimension.
yeah,
You've been, as I mentioned, in all your life, very much internationalist. So perhaps from your experience in Peace Corps, why international dimension in your life was so important for you? Can you give us?
well, I thought about that, you know, because you sent these questions beforehand, and one of the early things, which is kind of well, anyways, which is true for me, is I was raised as a Catholic. I'm not a practicing Catholic now, but we would have missionaries come to our church who had been working with people in Africa or South America. And as a kid, I remember just being awestruck by these individuals who had been working in this thing called other cultures or other countries and bringing their stories. And I just found that captivating. And the other piece to that is the impulse, in the simplest terms, to do good, to help people, to be of service. You know, that did have, I think that had an impact on me. And I think the other element as a young person is my mother was first generation Polish. And we would drive 3 hours to where she was, her home, not in Poland, but in upstate New York.
Right.
And for family reunions and holidays. And that Polish culture of just emotion, food,
Mhm.
generosity
Mhm.
was very different from this little farming community in a rural area of New York where we actually lived.
Interesting.
You know, it was small town. People kept their emotions inside. They
Mm.
spoke very laconically, very briefly, no unnecessary words. And then to go into this weekend of where no one stopped talking, people talked at the same time, high emotion, affectionate. And so I think that was the other thing is realizing that people, there are all different ways that people operate, you know, this thing called culture. And then probably the turning point, though, as an adult, you're right, is that spending 2 years in the Peace Corps, 62 to 64, and going into Pakistan. And I must say, you know, we go through 10 weeks of training that as an American, I realize I went over there quite arrogantly, not realizing I was arrogant, but really believe we've got the answers. Otherwise, why wouldn't we, you know, why are we here? And then that whole 2 years of, you know, coming up against, you know, when you're trying to do something and people don't respond and having to learn and talk and so on culturally, coming to terms with the fact that, you know, there are some very creative and bright people in this culture too, and they've got ideas. And so as a 21-year-old, that was probably my deepest cross-cultural experience. You know, I was teaching and I was supposed to introduce the scientific, I was teaching science, and I was supposed to help set up labs and teach, you know, kind of a scientific approach and have experiments and so on in what had historically in the university been from the British system, rote memory. You know, they memorize the lecture and they regurgitate that on an exam. And then a few weeks into my class, my students went on strike. They all sat down on their exam. They wrote their name on their exam and they handed in blank exams. And I was furious. And I went to the chairman and he had studied in America. So he was very sensitive to me and to his own students and so on. And what became clear is I was not sensitive to the fact that I could do whatever I wanted that I thought was important because that's why I was there. However, these students were going to be tested at the end of the year on what they memorized, not what I introduced. So I was being asked to introduce some new methods. However, those methods were not really incorporated into the larger system in the examinations. So, yeah, we basically had to strike a deal, you know, where I had to make sure the students were confident we were going to cover the stuff they needed for the exams. At the same time, we also need the stuff that I'm being asked to introduce in terms of some new ways of thinking. And so anyways, it's coming out of that with humility and realizing if you're going to work cross-culturally,
Right.
you come into it with some humility and curiosity. And so
Right.
that, you know, but the whole experience was incredibly changing for me, life-changing, and it was an exciting experience.
You know, it's very interesting to look at cross-cultural experiences of people. And I remember one quite famous American psychologist described in his lecture about his experience in native societies in Africa and in Asia. He measured IQ. And just IQ measurement, they showed not very high IQ. There's people, native people from African and Asian some societies. But he was so much surprised to see they very much survival skills, very good coping with their life, very high intelligence in dealing with challenges they faced in the environment. But at the same time, he was so helpless with his high IQ
Right, right,
in
right.
the environment. So we have to be a little bit perhaps careful to measure one culture from the measurement
Right.
instrument or from other cultures we bring.
Yes. Yeah, for sure.
Because each culture may have its own important skills, which would be very important in the environment, right? So now, you mentioned one of the biggest challenge you observed for last decades. It's rise of women in the society. They became more prominent and have more opportunity to develop themselves and play a role in society. Uh, and I know that you paid so much attention to girls' education, especially from developing countries. So can you please explain why it's so important? What do you expect? Or can we change even more, bring more changes to our society when we have more educated girls, women, especially from developing countries?
It's very interesting at different levels. One thing that I think is true is that the United Nations did some kind of an evaluation of what works in the developing process, and they came out of it thinking that where you need to put your money in the hand of women, and whether it's because us guys are idiots and irresponsible, or what is it that goes on, somehow the women had uh, uh, the, um, the the makeup or the relationships, orientation, whatever, to, I don't know whether it's to be more responsible, or I don't know what the explanation is, but I can give you a couple examples that are interesting. Is that we were we formed this nonprofit. A group of us who had been in the Peace Corps in Pakistan formed a nonprofit agency in 2005, and one of the choices was to focus on women's education. And what is a story that we heard with one family example, but I think it typifies what goes on in that situation. Is this is mostly like in rural areas, isolated areas, which is where we were funding projects up in the northern part of Pakistan, up in the mountains, where a lot of other funding agencies don't really go or reach. And so we had the flexibility, since we just had private donations, to do whatever we felt was appropriate. But the first daughter out of a family to go to school, the family would be maybe very resistant, and someone from the school would have to come and spend time with the family to assure the safety of the daughter, and exactly what the situation is going to be like. And then the daughter goes off, completes her education, gets a degree, and then she gets a teaching job in the village. She now is bringing income back into the family.
Mm.
Now the family sees, this is maybe a positive thing.
Mm.
And then the second daughter does not experience that resistance. And so from the family, and so it's easier then for that daughter to go. And so you get that change in the family's attitude. And then, of course, the women themselves get educated, and they go off into a job and have their own influence. Right. And where more and more women are coming into the schools, and fewer where there were men teachers before. And the same thing where we were taking a couple of years, and we were funding a small scale agricultural project in this village, just a matter of maybe a dozen people with this nonprofit. And so, and again, the women are taught to raise chickens, and they start selling their eggs in the market. And the increase of their income is in multiples. I mean, we can't appreciate, I don't remember the numbers, but at that level, in a rural area, in a village in Pakistan, they can increase their income fourfold or fivefold from what it was. Well, obviously, then that happens, and the family is thinking, oh, that's pretty good. My wife is raising chicken, bringing more money in, or my daughter is raising chickens. And what you come out of it is realizing how when you talk about resistance in some countries to women's education, and because many of them are Muslim countries, you can start thinking, oh, it's the religion. But my feeling on it, no, it's not the religion, it's the culture. Because you can interpret religion in lots of different ways. But so it is not the religion that's holding up this resistance. Some people may be using religion as a tool for political purposes.
Right.
But at a personal level, there's a cultural change that can take place. And so anyways, I think that's really a very powerful, I think, because it's on one hand, it's a small scale, but it's like so many things, it's a microcosm of something larger. And so then when you have 25, 50, 100, 1,000 people doing small scale stuff like that, it adds up to major change.
Yeah. I'm absolutely sure that the best investment countries and societies could do, it's investment in girls' education.
Yeah.
It has a huge effect. Even perhaps there are several studies been done on relationship between women's education and intelligence of their children. There is a correlation. If women have better education, usually it positively affects thinking abilities and the intelligence of their children. That has even such a huge effect, not only on women themselves, but on their children. That's very beneficial for society as a whole. Now, Millard, I know that you worked with many type of entities like companies, businesses, governments, organizations, universities, individuals. You consulted, you did a lot of projects. And I'm wondering, can you tell a little bit about your observations of personal effectiveness and personal talent of people who work in different settings, in governmental organizations, non-governmental area, business, just individuals, universities? Where did you meet the most talented and the most effective people? In which setting?
Okay, that was interesting. It was an interesting question, and I thought about that. And what struck me is that I've been fortunate, been able to work in a lot of different settings, and so the settings are not, whether it's a business or a community, it is not the settings that define the individual, but it's the work that in the 60s, I was working as a community organizer in low-income communities in West Virginia. And I swear, some of the individual local leaders there that grew into being leaders of a community, a neighborhood, to sit there and watch some of the meetings going on, you think, my God, this guy could be a CEO of General Motors. This guy is so skilled in connecting with this group of people and listening to them and rephrasing and understanding what they're trying to say. And the difference between a low-income community and a business might be the sophistication of the language that they use. I mean, they may be more facile with the English language, but in terms of their capacity to be able to envision what we're really trying to do, to be able to translate that into what are the things that we need to do, and who do we need to think about, who do we involve, and to be, adaptable, to be flexible. I mean, that's and the same thing in when I was in Pakistan, the Peace Corps, to be, when I was frustrated with a student strike and I went and met with the chairman, this guy was the sweetest man and could sit there and listen, and he had the respect of everyone in the department. And so there are, I guess you can say, there are characteristics of people who are leaders, and these people are in every sector of the world and at every level, low-income communities, and etc.
Yeah.
Business, government.
But I guess it might be one more factor which may play a role. For example, the whole environment. Now in Uzbekistan, and I believe in some other neighboring countries with a similar level of development, there is a huge interest to be entrepreneurs now, because there are a lot of opportunities to be a businessman, to open up your own company and to make money. And a lot of very talented people go to this direction. In some countries, like in many European countries, like France, traditionally to go to government, it was very kind of incentive. A lot of very talented people tried to go to be part of government. It was a prestige. But I know that in United States, traditionally, I don't know what's now, but traditionally, a lot of also people try to be independent, and many talented people go to just to be successful themselves, to set up companies, etc. Perhaps these kinds of general environment also affects where most people or most talented people tend to go. But at the same time, of course, you could find very talented people in every sector. But just to be talented, very often it's not enough. You might be genius, talented, but without some environment, some support, it's very, very difficult to accomplish something. So perhaps your natural talent and environment, both factors are very important for people to succeed. Just one more additional question to this. In your opinion, because I know you worked with many, many individuals, talented people, what helps a person to be efficient, to be successful? So can you just mention some factors which are very important to be successful in this life?
There are some things which I think come to mind, which are fairly conventional. I think they have a vision, they have risk taking, they've got interpersonal relationships, and so on and so forth. And but the other thing that I would add, that I thought more about, is a personal resilience. Is that if you're planning to do something, especially something that may be innovative or something new, you're going to obviously have to recognize there's going to be several failures along the way. And I think so some level of resilience becomes really, really important. And, just the way that has come home to me is something that I haven't recognized so much before, but I think is very important, is I think, like we, our one son died about 1.5 years ago, Gabriel. And the experience as a parent that's the sort of thing that parents, that's the worst thing you could imagine as a parent. And you wonder, how would I ever survive that? We have more capacity to survive and to be resilient, to succeed than what we give ourselves credit for. And I mean, this is the big learning for me in the last 3 years with losing our son. And I think the same thing applies then. You are going to have any life that is lived to its full capacity will be filled with disappointment and failures. That will come with success and high points and happiness and all of that. And so, but it is the resilience that allows you to work with, in whatever way you're going to work with failure or disappointment. And the thing that I think you had dropped off before I mentioned that, but my experience and my wife's experience, what really helped us getting through to the extent that we did with the loss of our son was the community that we had of friends and friends that our son had that gave us so much support and love that it really was significant in its effect and for us. And I think that's the thing to remember is anything that you strike out to try to achieve, don't think you're going to do it by yourself. You've got to be aware of what is your, the term network, what are the relationships, who are the allies, who are the people that you can build confidence and trust to share your your doubts, your disappointments, your hopes, and so on. That there's a community of kindred spirits that you are going to be there, or you hope will be there for you. So I think those are some things that I think
that's very powerful. I fully agree with you. It's of course your individual talents are very important, but without your connections, support, and environment, it's very, very difficult to do anything in this life. And by the way, I'm so sorry for your loss. He was such a wonderful individual. He was a very talented. He did a lot of very innovative work related with colors, and he was a visionary. It's a very big loss for you, for your family, and for his friends.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Please accept one more time my condolences.
Yeah.
And Millard, let's come back to international again, some dimension. Of course, what you said about achievement for individual resilience, all the support, these are very important. But there is one more dimension. I'd like to know your opinion about that. Still, there is a huge difference between the so-called developed countries and the so-called developing countries in many, many areas of life, in education, traveling, healthcare, just eating, environment, ecological things, etc., etc. And of course, there are much more opportunities for people, for individuals, for young people from rich countries to be more successful in these globalized environments. They could get better education, they may travel, they have more material resources, and in many cases also support from government, societies, etc. While in developing countries, there is a very little, might be support for education, traveling, and healthcare, etc., etc. So how these people, especially young people from developing countries, could achieve some result, be successful in this globalized environment? What would you advise them? How they could overcome this big inequality in environment in order to be successful? So what would be your some advices?
Well, with some humility, you know,
No, no, no. You have so much
you know,
international experience and you
right
help
here,
many people.
um, I'll say a couple things and then I'll give you an example of someone who is a remarkable person in Pakistan. Um, I think that clearly education becomes important. So taking
Mm,
advantage of whatever kind of formal or informal education you can
mm.
you can
Yeah, I
access for
agree.
yourself. I think to look around and see in your community or in your environment um, who appears to be successful in the way that you're interested in being successful,
Mm,
and connecting with that person, getting to
mm,
know that person,
mm,
interviewing that person. How did
mm,
they achieve what they did? And see if you can even cultivate a relationship, if that makes sense to you with that individual. Um, the again the idea of networking becomes really really important, and then
mm,
taking advantage of, very often there are resources that you have to dig around for, like in a developing country. Then I would look at different agencies, different finding out what the different Western embassies are doing, whether it's like the Dutch embassy or the UK or Germany or America, and what kinds of programs they may have that would be accessible to you in your own country. I mean, maybe many people want to go overseas and study,
mm,
but that's going to be much more competitive, and it's possible many people do that, but there's so many resources locally. Um, Now, an example that I will give you that's really quite inspiring to me is that there is a woman that we met. We went, a group, two or three of us went to Pakistan about 6, 7 years ago and visited different agencies and people and villages and stuff. And there's this one woman who is really incredibly ambitious and high energy in organizing workshops for women in business and women's empowerment and entrepreneurism.
mm,
And she was able, as I understand it, to get money from the U.S. Embassy. And apparently, the U.S. Embassy in that situation is giving a priority to women's empowerment and is funding the kind of projects that she's working on. And she has done a remarkable job of networking, I think. But it's an incredible story of resilience too, because 6 years ago, she and her husband were a couple that were running this nonprofit agency of literacy for women and small business and stuff. And we were funding some of the stuff they were doing. And her husband was assassinated one night.
mm,
And he was assassinated not because of that program, but his job, full-time job. He was a prosecuting attorney in Lahore and
mm,
worked for the government. And one of the things that he was onto is uh, a cartel that was into child prostitution and child trafficking, sex trafficking. And just one night on his drive home, they had blocked off a road and they killed him.
mm,
And given the conservative nature in that part of Pakistan, it was not possible for that woman to continue operating that nonprofit on her own. But over the course of the last 3 or 4 years, she has become a very strong, vocal person for women's empowerment and is
mm,
working with different organizations. And so I don't know the situation in many other developing countries now, but in Pakistan, which I think may be typical of many developing countries today, is there really is a rapidly growing middle class that's
mm,
emerging in the country. It's not like in the 1960s, Pakistan was a feudal society. landlords owned villages, acreage, and so on. And this is, there are more resources. It's not like an either or. There are more resources and more gradations in terms of economic status in these developing countries now. And so you do have resources that were not there at one time, 60, 50, 40, 30 years ago. And another example is kind of a somewhat related to your question, but it's a wonderful example, I think, is that 6 years ago when we had a chance to have dinner with a half dozen Pakistanis, people in their 30s and 40s. One guy had software company. He is running 2 schools, incubators for startup technology. Another guy who's a financial advisor. His wife was an independent film producer, and a woman who owned a ceramics factory. 40 years ago, there would not have been that group to sit down with. These are very affluent, ambitious Pakistanis that are in Pakistan, and they're still in Pakistan. And you don't see this in the news because it's all the politics and the government's being overthrown, or there's a dictatorship or whatever. And you don't get the news that there is also steady development that's taking place with large groups of people. And it's a wonderful piece to this group of people is that a few years earlier, the Taliban had come into one of the provinces in northern Pakistan, and they had burnt down many of the schools, especially the schools where the women were attending. Eventually, the Pakistani military were able to push the Taliban out of that province. But this group of people that we were having dinner with ended up raising money and rebuilding the schools in that province. And so even the work that we've done in the past of providing scholarships, 20 years ago, the role we played was, significant in our small scale way. Today, the part we play it's great, but it's not as needed now, because now you've got Pakistanis that are middle class, they are affluent, and also they do have a civic responsibility. You can see in the conversations and the work that they do, they care about their country. And
right.
they care
I think,
about
doing I think you could observe the same picture in many other countries.
Yes, I'm sure.
I'm sure that's very similar. And
So,
I absolutely agree with you about education. It's a key. But in this respect, perhaps we may add just one small thing, that now everywhere, almost everywhere, there is a huge opportunity to do some educational learning activities, education online. So you would live in some remote area in some African, Asian, or any other countries and get sometime for free, sometime for small money, very high quality online education. And it's very important to use these new kinds of resources as well.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree.
Yes, thank you. Millard, I have one or two more questions, if you don't mind. One, of course, sometime when we get such respectful age, we're still young, but already respected by many young people. Sometimes you may reflect on your life and think, well, what would I do if I would have such a opportunities, etc. So if you would start your life one more time with your current thinking, mindset, attitudes, what would you do? What kinds of profession would you choose? What kinds of mistakes would you try to avoid what was the case? And what would be your some new ambitions and goals? Again, by using your current mindset in this new environment.
Well, I start with the awareness that I feel very fortunate that I can look back and say I'm happy with the life that I've had. I'm so, whether it was the values from my family or whatever, I do feel that I've lived a relatively intentional life. To reflect on, am I happy with what I'm doing or the situation I'm in? And if I am not, then I need to change it in some kind of way. And so I do feel that, and I've been fortunate that my spouse has the same attitude. So we've had a life where, we've supported that attitude for each of us to make choices about what's really important to us. But to get to something concrete in terms of what you're asking, what I've thought about is very hypothetical, but I think that a thing I would consider is going into public health. Because I think, and partly being influenced like the whole COVID epidemic,
right,
and realizing that that is just one of many epidemics or serious health things that are going to, we're going to be faced with in the world. And it cuts across family, community, economics, politics, house. I mean, it's just so many systemic aspects to health that it would be a real interesting, public health would be a really, and I'm kind of interested in science and stuff. Public health would be I think, a really interesting field to be in. But I think the mistakes, no matter what you choose, you're going to have the mistakes. And that's of course,
sometimes you may think this is a mistake, but in few years you may discover that was a very good thing to do. So
right.
It's always we could reflect on that and reshape our thinking about our mistakes, and
because you can't predict you entirely, what's going to happen, and it's the whole thing that one door closes and another one opens, and I mean, the last thing I'm thinking of here is, the last year or so of my work, I was working with Western Washington with a public university, and we had money that came from the federal government. And the last year, I spent the year laying people off, about 30, 40 people, and I was the director of the program. Well, we came to, the last of the people, the last person to get laid off was yours truly. And I was 60, and there was a few months period that I was thinking, oh my God, my life is over. Will I ever be happy again? Will I ever have a sense of purpose again? And so finally, without going into a lot of detail and everything, what came to me is I had always wanted to study Spanish. And so about 4 or 5 months into my depression, I said to my wife, what do you think if I went to Guatemala for a month and studied Spanish? She said, please do, please leave. And so, and that was, again, one of these, kind of micro life changing, because it was a very intense, I was living with a family in Guatemala. I'm 60 years old, living with a family and going to Spanish classes every morning from 8 to 1. Your brain is just fried by the end of the day. It's so intense because it's just one-on-one. But by the end of the month, I found life again. I realized I love travel. I loved experiencing other cultures, which I was doing in Guatemala. And that's basically, again, the short story is I came back and my wife had another few months to work. And we decided, we both enjoy travel. We both enjoy other cultures. And I went back and got my certificate to teach English as a second language. And that's where we spent 4 years teaching English overseas. So we spent a year in China, Indonesia, Ecuador, and then the last one was Istanbul. And it was, and so
Wonderful.
we found
That's
life again, so
that's such an inspirational. That's wonderful. I also remember, just to add to this picture, a few years ago, I was in the United States in one of the universities, in fact, in Georgetown, and I was sitting in dining hall, and women came and sat next to me, and we started to eat and to have some conversation. And I learned that she was 78 at that time. And she said she just started her education in university. And I was a little bit surprised. I tried to be diplomatic, but nevertheless, I asked how, why, this kind of thing. And she said, I feel something might happen in our relationship with Cuba. Now I'm learning Spanish, business, finance. I would like to set up a touristic business, go with American tourists to Cuba and bring Cuban tourism. So I am thinking about setting up my business, etc., etc. 78 years old. And I said, that's great, wonderful. So, and perhaps that now if you are in American university settings, in campuses, you may see a lot of quite elderly people, students. They just enjoy education, not for getting degrees, but now just learning, opening up some new things. That's so inspirational, so nice. And of course, you could find a new meaning and wonderful things to do in any stage in your life. In this respect, of course, America is a very special country. You could start your career 5th, 6th, 10th, or 15th career anytime, and nobody would say to you, why? So that's a great.
Yeah.
So, Millard, the last question, if you don't mind. First of all, thank you very much for sharing your life experience and sharing with us your reflections and taking into account of all the things we discussed and also our conversation. Can you please share maybe 1 or 2 or maybe 3 very short some conclusions you could make when we are reflecting of our time, our life, and looking to our future? Conclusions, and maybe again some advice to young people, maybe to give a little bit more even inspiration. So if I may ask you.
Yeah. Again, you gave me these questions beforehand, so I had a chance to reflect. And a couple things that come to me, maybe 3 things. One is the importance to hold on to hope. And again, it's, especially now with the politics and all the campaigning, this is a big, it's sort of a cliche. But the image I sometimes have of the idea of hope is during the European Dark Ages, you had, monks in the monasteries translating Aristotle, into Latin or whatever, and never knowing whether anything will come of it. But that small action, eventually these other things added to it, but you had the Renaissance in Europe. So the idea is continuing to believe that whatever you're doing has some positive effect. I mean, choosing to do something positively. And you may be living in a particular depressing or dark time, but and it may not be something that you see in your lifetime, but to really hold on to that belief that acting positively has a use for you and for the larger culture. I think the other thing, which probably I've changed my thinking on when I was in my 20s, is to appreciate the importance of incremental change, small changes. I think that when I was in my 20s, I was less patient and interested in like revolutionary ideas and big change, system changes, and all this small stuff, you know, forget it. But now you can kind of, I appreciate that small changes, probably thinking more of it strategically, but small changes can lead to a larger vision. And to give attention to being successful in small ways and appreciating incremental change. And I think that the other thing that I mentioned earlier is everything is going to have failure to it, and finding a way to sustain yourself, to take care of yourself, to be resilient. One of the most striking things, again, coming back to the loss of our son, one of the most beautiful essays or poems that someone wrote to me is that there is no way of having love without grief. Grief and love go together, because if you have deep love, you will have deep grief. And that is the human experience. And there was a Catholic theologian who had this great statement that we are not human beings to have a spiritual experience here. We are spiritual beings to have a human experience here.
Yeah, great.
And to recognize that in your human experience, that comes with love, it comes with grief, it comes with success, it comes with disappointment. And to find a way to work and to find a way of creating a mindset that say, this is a gift that I have as a human being, as a human experience. The fact that I am able to feel grief, I am able to feel disappointment, I am able to feel sadness, along with feeling joy and hope, is the fact that I am so fortunate. I am a human being and I'm having this full experience. And to allow yourself to just, to embrace that, to hold that, to feel that. That's, that's being human. So, I mean, that's something I've learned, I think, in the last couple of years.
That's so wonderful. It's very powerful. I knew you as a management consultant, organization development specialist, international development person, but now I'm discovering you as a philosopher and a spiritual teacher guy.
Yeah.
So it's very wonderful to learn your new dimensions, your new sides. That's also great. Millard, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. I am so happy to see you again. As I mentioned, you played such a huge role and very positive role in my life. I greatly appreciate your contribution, and it's so nice to see you again. And I very much hope that we will be able to continue our conversation to open up many new things in our life. And why not to have another one, to hope to have another such a conversation, maybe in 1 year or so. So to look at our new experiences, again, to reflect on the world, what's going on, and to be able to see new wonderful sides of our lives. Thank you so much.
Well, Alisher, thank you very much. It's been like very easy, like picking up, not even knowing it's been 30 years. It's just like very comfortable sitting down and talking with you.
Right, 32
Like,
years
we
we
never
last
left
met, 32 years ago.
But you've also, you're an inspiration, and just following what you're doing, I just find it inspiring and wonderful that you have continued the work that you're doing. It's so important.
Thank you.
And it's a lovely time seeing you again. Thank you so
Thank you
much.
so much.